The Rebel Capitalist Show.
You know, I just was in Miami and I was a little uneasy there because, you know, there's 6,000 nuclear warheads pointed at you. So
I'm not too worried about nuclear warheads from the Russians. Actually, yeah. I think the greatest danger stalking the world today is, believe it or not, our own government, the U.S. government. Not just because it's gotten out of control, invading other countries and fomenting trouble all around the world, but just domestically, it's one damn thing after another, because we have actual Jacobins, actual Bolsheviks that are in charge in Washington right now.
Yeah. And
when I say that, what I mean is that these people in Washington now share the exact philosophy, and they have the same psychological makeup as these people that fomented the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And they want to do the same thing here. I really believe that. Anyway, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Doug, did you ever read the book, The Prince by Machiavelli?
I did. I read it in high school. Actually, I read it a couple of times.
I've tried to reference that book and then look at today's events through that lens, understanding the influence it had on a lot of these political leaders, the World Economic Forum, the global elite, how much influence it had on Kissinger. So I'd love to get your take on that. Have you made those connections between Machiavelli, the Prince, and today's global elite and politicians, or am I just reading into it, do you think?
Well, the problem isn't so much an author like Machiavelli. He's a practical guy giving practical, good advice to people that run a state. From my point of view, the problem is the state itself. It's right. The institution of government. Now, why do I say that? It's because most people hear that and they immediately turn off. They think, oh, this guy is crazy talking that way. We can't live without a government. But the question really becomes, can we live without an institution without a institutionalized coercion in society? And that's what government is. It's the power of the state comes out of the barrel of a gun. So I don't believe in government as a way to order affairs. And therefore, Machiavelli and the Prince, it's just a helpful guidebook for the bad guys that run governments.
Right. And you referenced earlier that you see it getting worse. I want to go over this push that I've seen in the United States. Now, fortunately, I spend most of my time outside the United States like you do. I'm not down in Uruguay or Argentina, but I spend a lot of time in Medellin, Colombia. So I can kind of just watch it from a distance. But one thing that's probably the most disturbing thing I've seen lately is this push towards censorship in the United States, very disturbing push towards censorship. And it's not just censorship, it's that they're trying to make you believe absurdities. And anything that is contrary to this absurd narrative, they're deeming misinformation or disinformation. And it reminded me of that quote. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I'm not sure who said it, but it's something to the effect, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And what is your view on that? And what have you noticed as far as this push towards censorship in the United States and with these big social media companies?
Well, you're absolutely correct about that. But it's only a part of the problem.
Right.
Actually, Western civilization itself is under attack. And Western civilization in all the world's history is the only civilization that amounts to a hill of beans, that's worth anything. In fact, it's worth everything. And I recently put together a list of, it turns out, 12 things that are essential to Western civilization and unique to Western civilization. No other civilization has these things.
Right.
And freedom of speech is one of them.
Mm.
But there are 11 others, and they're all crumbling right from under our feet. But freedom of speech is certainly one of the most important, because if you can't talk, then it's impossible to do, because you can't communicate. So this is really, really serious. And these people have control of the apparatus of the state. They have total control of academia and the school system. They control large corporations. They control the media. They control the entertainment business. And over the last 3 or 4 generations, they've indoctrinated one generation after another in their school system, where people just believe that collectivism and statism are part of the cosmic firmament. So I take a very gloomy view, George.
Yeah, and I've heard them, going back to the atrocity or absurdities things, I've heard them actually say that we need to censor free speech in order to save democracy. That's the most recent battle cry from the kind of the media who's pushing that narrative in the United States. How does this compare, Doug, to when you first started really observing and talking about this stuff in the 1970s? Because back then, I'm sure we had many of the same problems, but were they just there to a lesser degree, or how would you contrast the two eras?
Well, look, we had a Supreme Court justice. I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, but I'm not a Supreme Court scholar. And he said back in the 30s that free speech and the First Amendment are an absolute. Now, in a way, that's kind of a stupid statement for a Supreme Court judge to make, because the whole Bill of Rights, all 10 amendments, should be absolutes. You shouldn't zero in on just one. But the whole Constitution at this point is a dead letter for practical purposes anyway. But just in my lifetime, free speech has really been flushed completely. You've got to be careful about what you say. Look, George, sometimes in the past, when I gave speeches, and you're supposed to tell a joke to warm the audience up, okay? Right. Got to open with a joke when you're giving a speech. So I often like to tell this one. It's that, hey, people ask me sometimes, Mr. Casey, who are you? Be giving financial advice. You've never even had a real job in your whole life. So how is that? How come you've never had a real job? And I always answered, well, on those employment application forms where they ask you, do you advocate the overthrow of the US government by force or violence? I always checked violence. Now, that's a funny joke, but I can't tell that anymore.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I think, the pushback that people with a different view would have is, oh, well, there isn't really an attack on free speech, because that is really about the government limiting free speech. And right now, we're just talking about social media companies limiting free speech. And I would grant them that. I don't like to get the government involved in any type of free market capitalism at all. I'm an absolutist there. But I think it's just more the narrative and the push towards favoring any groups in society, censoring more and more and more, and being the arbiter of truth and disinformation. I'm seeing that more and more pervasive, and that's what concerns me most. But do you have another pushback against those people that say, oh, Doug, you're just exaggerating this. It's only applicable to the government in free speech. That doesn't apply to society.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely correct. But this is a matter of psychology. And you've got two kinds of people in the world: people that believe in voluntary associations and people that believe in coercion and imposing their will on other people. Now, the latter type, the coercion-related people, are just drawn to government the way a moth is to a flame. But they're drawn to big organizations, they're everywhere. Once they get into a position of power, they like to use their power to impose their will on other people. This is why government itself is necessarily corrupt, because just like a certain type of person, you only get a certain type of person that will join the mafia, for instance.
Right.
And you get a different type of person that wants to go to Hollywood and be an actor. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But there's a certain type of person that likes the idea of being employed by the government and worse, becoming powerful in the government. But all these people like to enforce their will on other people. But the problem with the social media companies today is that they've actually become hand in hand with the government. Right. They've become instrumentalities of the government. They're totally hooked up with the government. I mean, the people that run these big corporations, just like the people that run all branches of all these governments, they all go to the World Economic Forum in Davos every year. And it's not a conspiracy. They're just people that have common interests and common values and common philosophies and ways of thinking. And they'd like to keep the plebs in order. So
and
it's serious.
And one thing that I don't hear many people talk about is, you were saying that the government draws these people like a moth to a flame. It draws them in. These people, there's a certain type of person that's drawn to government, and usually they lack, let's just say, a moral North Star, to say the least.
Yes.
But what I've noticed is the bigger government gets, the more power we give government, the more it attracts people that we don't want to be in government. Like the more power hungry someone is, the more they're drawn to government that has power over all the plebs, to use your word, But if we've got a very small, limited government, then all of these sociopaths, these megalomaniacs, they don't want anything to do with being president or governor or anything like that, because the government itself doesn't wield them the power that they desire.
Yeah, you're right. And this is one reason why, as time has gone on, I've become more and more pessimistic about the way the future is evolving. It's because if you just look at the historical facts, at the beginning of the 20th century, back in 1900, that is to say, governments around the world took typically less than 10% of the economy. Income tax was nowhere. Sales tax, nowhere. Most governments just maintained themselves with import duties and some excise taxes and various shakedowns. But government was a minor nuisance back then. Now, everywhere in the world, it's not just the US, government controls, often basically owns 50% or more of the economy.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we can turn it around at this point, because it's a trend that's been in motion for a long time now. And trends in motion generally stay in motion, and they accelerate. And they don't end until they run into a brick wall. And I'm afraid that I think the brick wall is very near at hand at this point. So we could be looking at a real catastrophe over the next decade.